Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Emotion, a very short introduction, 2nd edition, by Dylan Evans. Narrated by Derek Perkins. Publisher's note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to illustrations and figures present in the print and e-book formats of this book. Preface to the 2nd edition. This is a fully revised and updated edition of Emotion, a very short introduction, which was first published under the title Emotion, the Science of Sentiment in 2001. A great deal has happened in research on emotions since then, and this new edition incorporates some of these new developments. However, the main outlines of the story remain the same. The scientific study of emotion owes much to the philosophers of the Enlightenment. David Hume, Adam Smith, and Thomas Reid all wrote at length about the sentiments and the passions. These thinkers believed that emotions were vital to individual and social existence. Smith did not just found the dismal science, economics. He also helped to pioneer the sentimental science, the psychology of emotion. In his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, he proposed that emotions were the thread that wove together the fabric of society. Like Hume and Reid, Smith did not regard emotion and thought as implacable enemies. For all of these thinkers, it was rational to be emotional, and no science of the mind could be complete without also addressing the heart. The Romantics rejected this view, reviving an older view of emotions as fundamentally at odds with reason. Humans were faced with a stark choice between emotion and reason, and the wise ones chose to follow their hearts rather than their heads. To return to innocence meant listening to one's feelings rather than consulting logic. The secrets of sentiment were to be unlocked by poetry, not by science. I have a great deal of sympathy with the Enlightenment view of emotion. Unlike the Romantics, I do not believe that emotions are fundamentally at odds with reason, nor that we should always follow our hearts rather than our heads. Rather, like Adam Smith, I believe that intelligent action results from a harmonious blend of emotion and reason. I believe that a creature without emotions would be less rational than us, not more, but I also believe that there are times when it is better to listen to the head rather than the heart. Knowing when to follow our feelings and when to ignore them is a valuable talent that some have called emotional intelligence. In this book, I argue for a return to the view of emotions as reason's ally, not its enemy. Like Smith and Hume, I believe that the scientific study of emotion is not only possible, but of great value. This is not because I think we can ever reduce emotional experience to a dry formula. However, thinking more clearly about emotion need not be opposed to feeling more deeply. It is my hope that knowing more about how emotions work can help us to lead richer lives, not poorer. At the very least, it can be exciting to learn about the recent scientific advances in our understanding of these mysterious phenomena. Scientific interest in the emotions underwent something of a renaissance in the 1990s. For much of the 20th century, research in the emotions was confined to a few psychologists and even fewer anthropologists. Today, however, things are rather different. Emotion is now a hot topic. Many anthropologists now reject the view that emotions are culturally specific. Cognitive psychologists have abandoned their exclusive focus on reasoning, perception, and memory, and are rediscovering the importance of affective processes. Neuroscientists and researchers in artificial intelligence have also joined the debate, contributing further pieces to the jigsaw. This book attempts to step back and put some of these pieces together. Needless to say, a short book like this cannot hope to cover all aspects of such a complex area. I have had to leave some very interesting areas of emotion research to one side. The reader will not find, for example, a discussion of how emotions develop in children, although this too is a burgeoning area of study. Nor is there any mention of the growing literature on individual differences in emotional experience. My choice of topics reflects my own idiosyncratic interests and my guesses about what will prove most interesting to a general audience. The word emotion is fairly recent. Before the 19th century, people talked instead about passions, sentiments, and affections. Chapter 1 begins by outlining the complex history of these words. It then goes on to explore the variety of emotional experience in different cultures. Every culture has its own emotional climate, and I draw on anthropological research that has documented some of these variations. However, many anthropologists now think that the differences between emotional experiences around the world are minor when compared with the similarities. In Chapter 1, I argue that emotions constitute a kind of universal language that binds humanity together into a single family. Our common emotional heritage goes deeper than the cultural differences that set us apart. We owe this shared emotional repertoire to our common ancestry. We are all descended from a few thousand hominids who lived on the African plains 100,000 years ago. Many of our emotions were forged in this bygone age. Many more emotions go back even further, to a time when our ancestors were not even human. In Chapter 2, I explore the evolutionary history of emotion and argue that emotions were, and still are, vital for survival. Emotions are not just luxuries. Still less are they obstacles to intelligent action, as many philosophers have believed. The creators of Star Trek were wrong to suppose that the Vulcans, an imaginary alien race that had learned to suppress their emotions, would be more intelligent than humans. Spock, notwithstanding, an intelligent creature that lacked emotions, simply could not evolve. Of course, we now live in very different environments from those in which our ancestors evolved. In particular, we have many means of inducing happiness in ourselves that our ancestors never even dreamt of. In Chapter 3, I discuss these technologies of mood that promise to provide us with shortcuts to happiness, from psychotherapy and art to drugs and meditation. I ask whether or not they work, and discuss the dangers that beset some of these attempts to circumvent the more circuitous path to happiness that natural selection laid out for us. In Chapter 4, I explain how emotions affect cognitive capacities, such as memory, attention, and perception. The power of emotions to affect these things makes emotional technologies very appealing to advertisers and politicians. Appealing to feelings offers a way of making people change their minds without having to provide good arguments or evidence. I conclude the chapter by exploring some of the recent research in the psychology and neuroscience of empathy. The most recent discipline to have entered the debate on emotion is artificial intelligence. Since the early 1990s, computer scientists have become increasingly interested in building emotional machines, and workers in robotics are already making some progress in this area. In the final chapter, I discuss these recent developments and speculate on where it will all lead. Will we succeed in building robots that have feelings just like we do? And what might be the consequences of such technology? Research in this area is moving fast, and I have completely rewritten this chapter to reflect the advances that have taken place since the first edition of this book was published in 2001. I do not pretend to have the last word on emotion. A really good theory of emotion may remain forever beyond our grasp. However, I find the scientific study of emotion illuminating and fascinating. I hope that reading this book will lead you to share my enthusiasm. Dylan Evans, October 2018. Chapter 1. What is an emotion? The word emotion is a modern invention, and not a particularly helpful one. The first books to use the word in the title do not appear until the 19th century. The most famous of these is The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals by Charles Darwin, which was published in 1872. Philosophers and poets had been writing about things like anger, pity, and fear for thousands of years, of course, but they had never before grouped these mental states together under a single umbrella. On the contrary, they had been more concerned to draw distinctions between them, categorizing some of them as passions and desires, and others as affections and sentiments. Thus, when the Scottish psychologist Alexander Bain announced in his 1859 book, The Emotions and the Will, that he would use the word emotion to cover to all that is understood by feelings, states of feeling, pleasures, pains, passions, sentiments, affections. He was marking a fundamental shift in the vocabulary that we use to describe how the mind works. Behind this terminological shift lay a deeper conceptual revolution, the birth of modern psychology, a self-professed scientific approach to the study of the mind, modelled on the natural sciences, especially physiology. The pioneers of this new approach were explicit about their desire to break with traditional ways of discussing and studying the mind, which were inextricably bound up with theology and ethics. Take theology first. The emergence of scientific psychology in the 19th century was closely linked with the decline of Christianity among the elites in Europe and North America. Scientific psychology was explicitly cast as a new, thoroughly secular approach to the study of the mind, in contrast to the long tradition of Christian thought which had dominated this and most other areas of study in the West for the previous 15 centuries. Words like passion, lust, and desire all had a biblical pedigree which the pioneers of scientific psychology wished to dispense with. The term passion, in particular, was associated with the gospel accounts of the sufferings and death of Jesus. By replacing all these words with a term like emotion, which was free of such connotations, the new scientific approach signalled its distance from theological ways of thinking. Even older than the theological framework was that of ethics. Long before Christianity had appeared on the scene, the philosophers of ancient Greece had given a central place to things like pity, fear, and anger in their debates about the good life. Plato famously divided the mind into 3 distinct faculties or elements: reason, appetite, and thumos, which can be variously translated as anger, spirit, or indignation. This analysis seems distinctly odd from a modern perspective. Contemporary psychologists might wonder why Plato singles out anger from the other emotions and reserves a whole faculty of the mind for this particular feeling. What about sadness, fear, and guilt? Where do they figure in this account? Yet this simply highlights the distance between ancient approaches to the mind and that of today. Psychologists may now group together a variety of mental states in a single category called emotions, but that is a modern invention and would have made no sense in ancient Greece. For Plato, the whole point of dividing the mind into 3 distinct parts was to understand how best to live. It was not what we today would call a scientific exercise, which is supposed to be objective and value-neutral, but an ethical one. The good person, in Plato's view, is one in whom all 3 elements of the mind are in harmony, and each element performs its proper function. This is only possible, Plato taught, when both appetite and thumos are subordinated to reason. This idea was developed into a whole system of thought by another Greek philosopher, Zeno of Citium, the founder of Stoicism. The Stoics taught that the good life consisted in freedom from all passions, pathe. The passions, as the Stoics understood the term, were strong feelings that troubled the mind, such as intense anger and excessive joy. The passions, they argued, are like mistaken opinions, since they arrive from putting too much value on things that are not really so important. The wise person does not value trivial things, and so attains peace of mind, apatheia. This is not a complete absence of feeling. On the contrary, the Stoic who judges things correctly experiences contentment, eudaimonia, and good feelings, eupatheia. But these are mild and sweet, rather than strong and stormy. Stoicism has been a remarkably persistent influence in Western thought. Far from dying out with the rise of Christianity, it was woven into theology by Christian thinkers from Boethius to Justus Lipsius. But there is something odd about this, as there is about many other attempts to combine Christianity with Greek philosophy. The founder of Christianity is quite the opposite of a serene Stoic. Jesus flies into a holy rage when he sees the temple in Jerusalem filled with merchants and money changers, and drives them out of the temple with a whip. When he is dying on the cross, he cries out in agony, my God, why have you forsaken me?" A major strand of Christian piety celebrates these strong emotions, from St. Augustine to St. John of the Cross. As Martha Nussbaum observes, the Christian idea of love is unashamedly passionate, even erotic. We hear sighs of longing and groans of profound desolation. We hear love songs composed in anguish as the singer's heart strains upward in desire. We hear of a hunger that cannot be satisfied, of a thirst that torments, of the taste of a lover's body that kindles inexpressible longing. We hear of an opening that longs for penetration, of a burning fire that ignites the body and the heart. All these are images of a profound erotic passion, and all of these are images of Christian love. Whatever the relationship between Stoicism and Christianity may be, the self-professed scientific approach to the mind that arose in the 19th century wanted to dispense with both of these traditions. Psychology was to be morally neutral, free from the ethical framework in which the Greek philosophers had couched their approach to the mind, and completely secular, free of religious connotations. And to make this abundantly clear, psychologists needed a new vocabulary. The word emotion fitted this need perfectly. The problem was, nobody knew what the new word really meant. When the Edinburgh professor of moral philosophy, Thomas Browne, used the term in his lectures in 1810-20, he told his students that the exact meaning of the term emotion is difficult to state in any form of words. 2 centuries later, things are not much clearer. Psychologists still disagree about how to define the term. As the philosopher Thomas Dixon wryly observes, this is hardly surprising for a term that, from the outset, was defined as being indefinable. Yet this may not be as much of a problem as it seems, for although a precise definition may prove elusive, it remains true, as Thomas Browne stated in his Edinburgh lectures 200 years ago, that every person understands what is meant by an emotion. The word emotion may, in other words, be rather like jazz, in the sense that you know it when you see it or feel it, even though you can't define it. Or, as the jazz musician Louis Armstrong famously quipped, if you have to ask what jazz is, you'll never know. Basic emotions. Instead of attempting to provide a concise definition of emotion, it may be more fruitful to identify some typical examples. Few people would deny that anger, fear, and joy are emotions. When it comes to enumerating a complete list of emotions, however, there is little consensus. The British psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen identified close to 1,000 emotion words in the adult English lexicon and classified them into 23 mutually exclusive categories. Other researchers argue for a smaller number of categories. In an attempt to make sense of these widely differing approaches, the philosopher Paul Griffiths divides emotions into 3 distinct groups: basic emotions, higher cognitive emotions, and culturally specific emotions. Basic emotions include joy, distress, anger, fear, surprise, and disgust. Basic emotions are universal and innate. This much is clear from the fact that babies who are born blind still make the facial expressions typical of these emotions, smiling, grimacing, and so on. Emotional expressions are not like words, which differ from culture to culture. They are closer to breathing, which is just part of human nature. For a large part of the 20th century, many anthropologists rejected the idea that any emotions were universal or innate, for they subscribed to a view known as the cultural theory of emotion. According to this view, emotions are learned behaviors, transmitted culturally, much like languages. Just as you must first hear English before you can speak it, so you must first see others being joyful before you can feel joy. On this theory, people living in different cultures should experience different emotions. Box 1. Basic emotions. Basic emotions are universal and innate. They are of rapid onset and last a few seconds at a time. Researchers disagree about how many basic emotions there are, but most would include the following in their list: joy, distress, anger, fear, surprise, disgust. Some researchers call these emotions by different names. It is common, for example, to see happiness and sadness in the list of basic emotions. I think these words are better used to describe moods rather than emotions, so in this book I use the words joy and distress to refer to basic emotions, and reserve the terms happiness and sadness for good and bad moods. In the late 1960s, while this view of emotion was still the reigning orthodoxy, a young American anthropologist called Paul Ekman set out to find firm scientific evidence in its favor. To his great surprise, he ended up doing just the opposite. Ekman's studies provided the first scientific evidence that the cultural theory of emotion was badly off the mark. Ekman's methodology was simple but clever. He traveled to a remote, pre-literate culture, the Fore in New Guinea, to ensure that the subjects had not seen Western photographs or films, and so could never have learned Western emotions. Ekman then told them various stories and asked them to choose, from 3 photographs of Americans expressing various emotions, the photo that most closely matched the story. For example, one story involved coming across a wild pig when alone in a hut, a situation that would elicit fear in Westerners. Sure enough, the 4 pointed to the same expressions that Westerners linked to the stories. Just to be sure, Ekman asked some 4 people to make facial expressions appropriate to each of the stories and videotaped them. On returning to San Francisco, he did the experiment in reverse, asking Americans to link the 4 faces to the stories. Once again, the judgments tallied. When Ekman first presented his results to the American Anthropological Association, he was met with cries of derision. The cultural theory of emotion was so entrenched that any criticisms were simply laughed out of court. Eventually, however, Ekman won the argument. It is now widely accepted among emotion researchers that some emotions, at least, are not learned, but innate. Of course, the die-hard proponent of the cultural theory of emotion can always retort that Ekman's studies showed only that the facial expressions associated with basic emotions are universal and innate. The studies tell us nothing about the subjective feelings behind those expressions. This is true enough, but the same applies to everything that is private and subjective. I can never be sure, for example, that your experience of the color red, or your sense of the sweetness of sugar, are the same as mine. However, if our subjective experiences were really so radically different, it is difficult to know how we could ever communicate at all. We might be able to use the same words in a similarly grammatical fashion, but if we were using them to represent fundamentally different concepts, we would surely end up in a hopeless muddle of misunderstandings. We would never be able to agree about anything. Now, while disagreement and misunderstanding are certainly common, they are not so common as to prevent all effective communication. Most of us seem to get our message across most of the time. When we read poems and novels written by authors from other cultures, we recognize the emotions they describe. If emotions were cultural inventions, changing as swiftly as language, these texts would seem alien and impenetrable. Communication is possible without words, too, and this is largely thanks to the basic emotions we all share. When anthropologists first come into contact with a previously isolated people, their only means of communication is via facial expressions and bodily gestures, many of which serve to express emotions. The anthropologists may smile, an expression that will be recognized immediately by the isolated tribespeople. The tribespeople may smile in return, showing the anthropologists that they share the same feeling. Our common emotional heritage binds humanity together, then, in a way that transcends cultural difference. In all places and at all times, human beings have shared the same basic emotional repertoire. Different cultures have elaborated on this repertoire, exalting different emotions, downgrading others, and embellishing the common feelings with cultural nuances. But these differences are more like those between 2 interpretations of the same musical work, rather than those between different compositions. Just as 2 orchestras will play the same symphony slightly differently, so 2 cultures will play out their emotional repertoire in different tones. It will be clear to all, however, that the score is the same. The universality of basic emotions argues strongly for their biological nature. If basic emotions were cultural inventions, their ubiquity would be very surprising indeed. If we suppose, however, that they are part of humanity's common biological inheritance, then their presence throughout the world is easy to explain. Just as all human beings have the same kind of body, with minor variations, so we all have the same kind of mind. This universal human nature is encoded in the human genome, the legacy of our shared evolutionary history. Now that the psychological unity of humankind is more widely acknowledged, it can be hard to understand how the cultural theory of emotion ever gained such widespread acceptance. Perhaps the answer lies in the equally universal human tendency to exaggerate the small differences between the various human groups. In the search for cultural identity, we naturally fix on the things that set us apart from others, rather than on the things that link us together. When it comes to emotions, we often pay attention to the small cultural differences and ignore the overwhelming similarities. European attitudes to the peoples of Southeast Asia are a case in point. For a long time in England and other parts of Europe, people from Japan, China, and countries in Southeast Asia were often described as being mysterious and unfathomable. This stereotype of the inscrutable Oriental was due in large part to the fact that European travellers found it hard to read their emotions. They wondered whether the poker face of the Japanese might conceal emotions that were very different from their own. The Japanese do, in fact, take greater pains to hide their emotions than do people in Europe and North America. Every culture has its own rules that define the socially acceptable forms of emotional expression. In Europe and North America, these display rules encourage vivid facial expressions of emotion. A poker face is generally regarded as dull or deceptive. In Japan, on the other hand, excessive emotional displays are often perceived as rude, and Japanese people consequently make more of an effort to attenuate their emotional expressions. Underneath these display rules, however, the emotions are the same. In an interesting experiment conducted by Paul Ekman and Wallace Friesen, American and Japanese men were videotaped while they watched film clips. Some of the clips were of neutral or pleasant events, such as a canoe trip, while others were of disgusting things, such as a ritual circumcision, the suction-aided delivery of a baby, and nasal surgery. In one showing, the subjects watched the clips in private, while in another an interviewer was present. When alone, similar facial expressions were observed in both American and Japanese subjects. When the interviewer was present, however, the Japanese smiled more and showed less disgust than their American counterparts. The most interesting thing about this experiment, however, became apparent only when the videotapes were viewed in slow motion. Only then was it possible to observe that when the interviewer was present, the Japanese subjects actually started to make the same expressions of disgust as the Americans did, and succeeded in masking these expressions only a few fractions of a second later. In other words, the same basic emotions were felt by both the Americans and the Japanese. These biological responses were automatic, beyond voluntary control. Only after consciousness caught up, a few hundred milliseconds later, could the learned display rules be imposed on top of the basic biological response. The inscrutable Oriental, then, is concealing not radically different emotions, but the very same emotions as those felt by all other human beings the world over. The European travellers who suspected that an alien mind lurked beneath the less expressive Oriental countenance were misled by the superficial differences between their display rules. As the experiment with the American and Japanese men demonstrates, basic emotions, such as fear and disgust, are automatic, reflex-like responses over which we have little conscious control. And, like reflexes, they are much faster than anything we do voluntarily. Thus, the culturally determined display rules always arrive on the scene after the basic emotional response has been set in motion. The basic emotions are hardwired, etched into our neural circuitry by our genes rather than by our culture, part of the basic mental design that is common to us all. Higher cognitive emotions. The second group of emotions identified by Paul Griffiths are the higher cognitive emotions. These are not so automatic and fast as basic emotions, and nor are they universally.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?